Welcome to my channel.
Pain in Lochdubh did not fall it arrived. It was a sentient, miserable entity that wrapped itself around the mountains of Sutherland like a sodden grey blanket, and then proceeded to lean heavily against the windows of the scattered houses below. It was the kind of weather that made the very idea of effort seem not only foolish, but positively dangerous. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was entirely in agreement with the weather. He was currently engaged in his favourite police activity, the strategic avoidance of duty. Strictly speaking, he should have been out checking on the sheep, worrying reported over at Drimdarroch, a task that involved mud, irate farmers, and very little chance of a cup of tea. Less strictly speaking, but of far more pressing concern, was the looming threat of Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife. She had cornered him yesterday, by the post office, her bosom heaving with organisational zeal, demanding he judge the best Highland fruit scone category at the upcoming church fete. Hamish knew from bitter experience that judging bakery items in Lochdubh was a political minefield that usually ended with him being glowered at by 3/4 of the village matrons for the next 6 months. Therefore, the only sensible tactical manoeuvre was to go to ground. His bunker of choice was the lounge bar of the Lochdubh Hotel. At 11 in the morning, it was deserted save for the smell of stale beer, lavender polish, and the comforting fug of a peat fire that Rory, the hotel owner, kept burning more out of habit than necessity. Hamish was a tall, gangly man with flaming red hair that defied gravity and any attempt at styling, and hazel eyes that were currently half closed in a fair approximation of a sleepy cow. His uniform looked as though it had been stored crumpled in a damp cellar. To the untrained eye, Hamish Macbeth looked like a man whose intellectual capacity was taxed by tying his own shoelaces. This was a carefully cultivated illusion that Hamish guarded fiercely. Looking stupid was the best defence against being asked to do things, and more importantly, the best defence against the dreaded spectre of promotion to Strathbane headquarters. He sat slumped deep in a worn leather armchair near the fire, nursing a large mug of black coffee. At his feet lay Lugs, a small, indeterminate mongrel of pessimistic temperament, who let out a heavy, shuddering sigh that perfectly articulated his master's feelings about the universe. Another coffee, Hamish. Nessie Curry, Rory's wife, fluttered over. Nessie was a kind soul who lived in a perpetual state of mild anxiety, mostly induced by her husband's legendary grumpiness. "Aye, thank you, Nessie," Hamish said, his voice a soft Highland lilt that seemed to meander rather than get to the point. "And perhaps one of those ginger biscuits, if Rory isn't counting them too closely." "Ah, away with you. He's in the cellar arguing with a barrel of ale." She busied herself refilling his mug. "Quiet morning, Hamish. It is that, Nessie. A blessed relief." The peace, however, was a fragile commodity in Lochdubh. It was shattered precisely 3 minutes later by the aggressive crunch of gravel outside, followed by the slam of heavy car doors. The noise was alien to the village, too hurried, too demanding. Hamish didn't move a muscle, but his eyes opened slightly wider. He watched the rain-streaked window over the rim of his mug, a Range Rover, polished to an obscene mirror finish that seemed almost insulting amidst the general Highland grime, had mounted the verge outside the hotel. The front door of the hotel burst open, admitting a gust of damp air and 2 individuals who instantly lowered the ambient temperature of the room. The leader of the expedition was a woman in her late 40s, clad in brand new, expensive tweed that screamed London tailor's idea of Scotland, rather than anything practical for a peat bog. She had brittle blonde hair, a face that seemed tightly drawn against the bone, and an aura of furious entitlement that preceded her by several feet. Behind her trailed a man, slightly younger, dressed in soft cashmere, and the beaten-down expression of someone who had long ago stopped winning arguments. He carried 3 oversized leather bags and looked as if he might burst into tears if startled. Nessie materialized from the kitchen, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Good morning, can I help you?" The woman did not respond to the greeting. She simply stopped in the middle of the rug and surveyed the lounge bar as if it were a particularly disappointing exhibit in a third-rate museum. Her gaze swept over Hamish and Lugs without registering them as human or canine beings worthy of note. They were merely rustic furniture. "We booked the suite," the woman announced. Her voice was loud, clipped, and entirely lacking in warmth. It was the voice of someone used to shouting at waiters in expensive postcodes. "The name is Gorsmythe, Mrs. Fenella Gorsmythe. And this is Mr. Gorsmythe." Rupert Gorsmythe managed a weak, apologetic smile over the pile of luggage. "Oh, aye, Mrs. Gorsmythe. We have you down." Nessie moved behind the small reception desk, flustered. Welcome to Lochdubh. It's a droopy day, isn't it? It's wet, Fenella corrected coldly. Now, my requirements sent ahead by email. I trust they have been met. The hypoallergenic pillows, the specific brand of alkaline water in the room, and I require assurance that the Wi-Fi is capable of handling high-definition video conferencing. I am a very busy woman. Hamish sank an inch deeper into his chair. He knew the type. They came north every summer, seeking authenticity and silence, and then spent their entire holiday complaining that the Highlands weren't exactly like Kensington, only with better views. Well, Nessie began, her voice trembling slightly. The pillows are there. The water, we had to order in special from Inverness, but it arrived. The Wi-Fi, though, well, it depends on the wind, you see. When it blows hard off the Atlantic, the signal gets a bit wobbly. Fenella Smythe stared at Nessie as if she had just admitted to sacrificing goats in the cellar. Wobbly? I don't do wobbly, Mrs. Whatever your name is. I am here to finish my memoirs. I require absolute peace and flawless connectivity. She turned sharply to her husband. Rupert, put the bags down. Don't just stand there like a lemon. Rupert dropped the bags with a thud. Fenella whipped out a smartphone and held it aloft, glaring at the screen. 1 bar. I have 1 bar of signal. This is unacceptable. How am I supposed to blog about the rustic charm if I can't upload? From his corner, Hamish watched. He saw the way Rupert flinched when his wife spoke, the tight, mean lines around Fenella's mouth, and the sheer, breathtaking arrogance that radiated from her like heat from a stove. Lugs let out another low groan, loud in the tense silence. Fenella spun around, finally noticing the scruffy policeman and his dog. Do you mind? She snapped. That animal is disturbing me. Hamish slowly lowered his coffee mug. He gave her a long, vacuous, open-mouthed stare. He just does that when the pressure drops, Mrs. It's his sinuses. Well, tell him to stop it. It's disgusting. She turned back to Nessie. Show me this room, and if it smells of damp, I shall require a discount. As Nessie led the formidable woman and her trailing spouse up the creaking stairs, Hamish took another sip of his coffee. The liquid was lukewarm now, but he didn't mind. He sensed the fragile piece of Lochdubh wasn't just broken, it was being actively trampled upon by handmade Italian leather boots. The scone judging competition was starting to look like the easy option. Hamish watched the swaying of the chandelier as Fenella's heavy footsteps thudded across the ceiling of the suite directly above. The hotel was an old building, constructed when people were smaller and perhaps less angry, and it seemed to groan under the weight of her demands. Lugs gave a final, sharp huff and rested his chin on his paws, closing his eyes in a show of canine solidarity with Hamish's desire for total stillness. But the stillness was short-lived. Rory Curry emerged from the cellar, his face the color of a bruised plum, clutching a ledger as if he intended to use it as a weapon. Did you see her, Hamish? Rory barked, not bothering with a greeting. The woman is a menace. She's been here 20 minutes, and she's already threatened to report the hotel to the Highlands Tourism Board because the tap in the bathroom hisses with a sarcastic tone. Sarcastic? It's a pipe, man. She's just a bit high-strung, Rory, Hamish murmured, closing one eye. Perhaps she needs a nice, calming walk in the rain. I hope she walks right into the loch, Rory muttered, heading behind the bar to reorganize his whiskey bottles with unnecessary violence. The afternoon did not improve. Fenella Smythe did not stay in her room to finish her memoirs. Instead, she descended like a predatory bird, clad now in a yellow oilskin that made her look like a very expensive and very annoyed canary. She marched out into the village, Rupert trailing behind her with a notebook and a look of profound apology. Through the window, Hamish watched them disappear into the mist. He knew what she was doing. He had seen her type before. She wasn't just writing memoirs. She was hunting for local color, which in Lochdubh terms meant she was going to poke her nose into every shop, kitchen, and garden until she found a secret she could polish into a scandalous anecdote. By 3 o'clock, the village was buzzing. The gossip in Lochdubh usually traveled at the speed of a gentle breeze, but Fenella had accelerated it to a gale. Mrs. Wellington had been insulted over the weight of her scones. The postmistress, Mr. Kennedy, had been accused of inefficient sorting, and Patel at the curry shop had been told his vindaloo lacked authentic London complexity. Fenella was making enemies at a rate of 1 every 10 minutes. Hamish was finally forced to leave his sanctuary when a call came through to the hotel from the station. It was a noise he had been dreading, the shrill, demanding ring of the black telephone. He sighed, hauled his lanky frame out of the chair, and adjusted his cap to a suitably jaunty, yet incompetent-looking angle. Macbeth here, he said into the receiver. Hamish! Where have you been? Frantic voice of the station clerk from Strathbane. There has been a report of a disturbance near the old pier. Some woman is screaming blue murder about a theft of intellectual property and a violation of privacy. Get down there before she bites someone. Hamish sighed, whistled for Lugs, and stepped out into the relentless Highland drizzle. The old pier was a crumbling wooden structure that jutted into the dark, peat-stained waters of the loch like a skeletal finger. As he approached, he saw a small crowd had gathered, standing at a respectful distance from the yellow-clad figure of Fenella Gorsmythe. She was standing over a discarded pile of lobster pots, her face contorted in a mask of such pure, crystalline rage that even the seagulls seemed to be keeping a wide berth. "Officer," she shrieked as soon as she spotted his red hair. "Finally! I have been accosted. This person," she gestured wildly at Archie McLean, the local fisherman who looked as though he had been carved out of a piece of driftwood, refused to tell me the real reason his brother left the village in 1994. He was aggressive. He used a Gaelic word I am certain was a profanity. Archie looked at Hamish and shrugged. "I told her he moved to Glasgow to work for the council. Hamish." She said that wasn't narratively satisfying enough. Hamish spent the next 20 minutes performing the delicate dance of Highland diplomacy, which mostly involved nodding, saying "Och, well now," and looking as though he found the entire situation much too complicated for his simple brain. Eventually, he managed to usher the fuming Fenella and the wilting Rupert back toward the hotel. "I shall be writing about this, Constable," Fenella shouted over her shoulder. "Stagnation of this village is not just a social failing, it is a crime against literature." "Aye, missus. I'm sure it'll be a grand book," Hamish said, watching them go. He felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. Lochdubh was a peaceful place, but it was a peace built on a foundation of carefully kept secrets and long-held silences. Fenella Gorsmythe was not just an outsider, she was a wrecking ball swinging at the village's carefully constructed walls. He decided to take the long way back, following the path that skirted the edge of the woods. The light was failing now, the sky turning a bruised purple. The rain had slowed to a fine, clinging mist that distorted shapes and muffled sounds. Lugs, usually a dog of stoic indifference, suddenly stopped. His ears pricked up, and a low, vibrating growl started in his chest. "What is it, boy?" "A rabbit?" Lugs did not move. He was staring at the base of a large, gnarled rowan tree that sat near the water's edge, just out of sight of the main road. Hamish moved closer, his boots squelching in the mud. At first, he thought it was just more discarded rubbish the village was plagued by fly-tipping tourists. It looked like a splash of bright, artificial colour against the grey-green of the Highland moss. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was the yellow oilskin. Fenella Gorsmythe was lying on her back, her expensive boots pointing toward the sky. Her eyes were wide open, staring up at the dripping branches of the rowan tree with an expression of profound surprise, as if death were just one more thing that failed to meet her exacting standards. But it was the manner of her passing that gave Hamish pause. She hadn't been stabbed, and she hadn't been shot. She was firmly pinned to the ground by a heavy, iron-bound Highland cabra, massive log used for the traditional games which had fallen, or been pushed, directly across her chest. Wedged into the corner of her mouth, like a cruel parody of a cigar, was a rolled-up bundle of her own manuscript pages. Hamish knelt in the mud, his face losing its vacant expression for a fleeting second. He checked for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. Her skin was already cooling in the damp air. He looked around. The woods were silent. No footprints were visible in the thick, wet heather, and the rain was already washing away any subtle clues the killer might have left behind. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered, the Highland lilt in his voice growing sharp and cold. "It seems someone finally gave Mrs. Gorsmythe the ending she was looking for." He stood up, the weight of the coming storm settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just a murder, it was a performance. And in Lochdubh, everyone was an actor. He knew what would happen next. The silence of the village would be shattered by sirens, and by something far worse, the arrival of the Strathbane CID. Hamish pulled his radio from his belt, his thumb hovering over the button. He looked at the dead woman, and then at the peaceful, dark hills. He really, truly didn't want a promotion. But as he looked at the manuscript stuffed into the dead woman's mouth, he knew the next few days were going to be anything but lazy. He keyed the radio. "Base, this is Macbeth. We have a situation at the Rowan Grove near the loch. You'd better tell Detective Chief Inspector Blair to cancel his dinner plans." The silence of the loch was not merely broken, it was assassinated. Rock faces of the surrounding mountains, sounding like the screams of the surrounding mountains, sounding like the screams of banshees caught in a gale. Within 40 minutes, the narrow, potholed track leading to the Rowan Grove was choked with vehicles. Headlights cut through the deepening gloom, illuminating the raindrops like silver needles. DCI Blair did not so much exit his car as explode from it. He was a squat, bull-necked man, with a complexion that suggested a lifelong devotion to gin and a violent temper. He stepped directly into a deep puddle, the icy water surging over the top of his expensive leather slip-ons. "Macbeth!" he roared, his voice booming across the water. "Where are you, you ginger-haired idler?" Hamish emerged from the shadows of the trees, looking more disheveled than usual. His red hair was plastered to his forehead, and his uniform was soaked through. Lugs sat beside him, shivering slightly, and looking at Blair with an expression of profound disapproval. "Right here, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic drawl that always managed to make Blair's blood pressure spike. "It's a nasty business, so it is." Blair stomped toward the body, followed by his silent, long-suffering shadow, Jimmy Anderson. Blair took one look at Fenella Gorsmitheth yellow oilskin, the crushing weight of the caber, and the paper-stuffed mouth, and let out a sharp, jagged laugh that had no humor in it. "A caber? My God, Macbeth, your village is even more backward than I thought. What is this? Some kind of Highland ritual? Did the local druids decide she was an unworthy sacrifice?" "She was an author, sir," Hamish offered mildly, ignoring the insult. "Staying at the hotel. She was not what you'd call popular." "Popular? Why? I don't care if she was the Queen of Sheba." Blair snapped, leaning over the body. He winced as his knees creaked. "Look at this. This isn't a murder, it's a statement. A caber this size weighs a fair bit. It takes a strong man to handle one of these, let alone drop it with such precision. It's obvious, isn't it?" He straightened up, a triumphant, ugly sneer spreading across his face. "Is that fisherman, isn't it? The one who lives in that shack by the water. What's his name? McLean? Archie?" Hamish blinked slowly. "Oh, Archie's a strong enough lad, sir, but he's got a bad back. Can't even lift a crate of herring without a groan. And he's got no reason to go killing tourists, even the ones that ask too many questions. Don't tell me who has a reason, Macbeth." Blair poked a thick finger into Hamish's chest. "You've been sitting here in the rain while the killer probably has his feet up by a fire. Look at the mouth, stuffed with her own book. That's spite, man. Local spite. You probably stood by and watched it happen, you useless peasant." Jimmy Anderson sighed, pulling out a notebook. "The husband, sir. Mr. Gorsmith. He was with her earlier." Blair waved a hand dismissively. "The husband? Did you see the man? He looks like he's about to collapse if you blew on him." "No. This took Highland muscle. I want a list of every man in this village who has ever competed in a Highland Games." "Well, start with them." "The games haven't been held since the late 80s, sir," Hamish noted helpfully. "Most of those lads are using walking frames now." Blair's face turned a shade of purple that matched the Highland heather. "I am the lead investigating officer, Macbeth. You are a village constable whose primary duty is to ensure the local sheep don't cross the road without a permit. You will stay out of the way. Anderson and I will handle the real police work. You can go and tell the husband his wife is a human paperweight. And try not to screw that up." "Aye, sir," Hamish said, his eyes going vacant. He watched as the forensic team, 3 men in white suits, who looked like bewildered astronauts in the mud, began to cordon off the area with blue tape. The tape flapped miserably in the wind, a thin plastic barrier between the order of the law and the chaos of the Highlands. Blair turned his back on Hamish, already shouting orders at the forensic team about DNA on the bark and checking for footprints, despite the fact that the rain had turned the entire grove into a soup of mud and rotted leaves. Hamish whistled low for Lugs. He didn't move toward the hotel immediately. Instead, he stood at the edge of the light, watching the way the caber lay across the woman's chest. It was perfectly centered. It hadn't rolled. It had been placed or dropped with a specific, cold intentionality. And the manuscript, he reached into his memory, recalling the way the pages had been rolled, not crumpled in a panic, but tucked in firmly. He looked at Blair, who was currently berating a technician for not having a bright enough flashlight. Hamish knew that if he found the killer too quickly, Blair would be forced to write a glowing report. If he looked too smart, the chief constable in Strathbane would start talking about career advancement again. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish whispered, turning toward the dark path that led back to the village. "Let the great man have his fun. We have some tea to drink, chow, and some questions to ask about a lady who liked to talk too much." As he walked away, the bright lights of the crime scene faded behind the trees, leaving him in the comforting, honest darkness of the woods. He needed to find Rupert Gore-Smythe, but first, he wanted to see Mrs. Kennedy at the post office. If Fenella Gore-Smythe had been digging for dirt, she would have started with the mail. And in Lochdubh, there was no dirt quite as rich as the kind found in a misdirected letter. Hamish Macbeth walked through the curtains of grey mist, the rhythmic squelch of his boots providing a steady beat to the swirling thoughts in his mind. Lochdubh, usually a village that slumbered in a gentle state of Highland decay, was currently vibrating with the frantic energy of an overturned beehive. Lights were flickering on in the small stone cottages, and silhouettes could be seen hovering near window frames, peering out toward the road where the police sirens still wailed like dying birds. To anyone watching, Hamish looked like a man defeated by the weather-lanky, rain-soaked figure with a dog that appeared to be made of wet wool and resentment. But behind that vacant, hazel-eyed stare, Hamish was already categorizing the village's collective guilt. In a place where everyone knew what their neighbor had for breakfast, a murder wasn't just a crime, it was an interruption of the social order. His first stop was the post office. In Lochdubh, the post office served as the unofficial central intelligence agency. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, possessed a pair of spectacles that seemed designed to see through envelopes, and a memory that archived every telegram sent since the coronation. As Hamish pushed open the door, the bell gave a sharp, accusatory ting. The chair inside smelled of old paper, sealing wax, and the faint, sweet scent of the peppermint lozenges Mrs. Kennedy sucked on when she was agitated. "Och, Hamish, you look like something the tide refused to take," Mrs. Kennedy exclaimed, her eyes widening behind her thick lenses. "Is it true, then? Is that poor woman truly dead, and crushed by a caber? It's like something out of those terrible historical dramas they show on the television late at night." Hamish sighed, leaning heavily against the counter. He looked at a display of dusty postcards as if they were the most fascinating objects in the world. "It is a sad day, Mrs. Kennedy. A very sad day for the reputation of our peaceful glen. B.C. Vi Blair is up there now, making enough noise to wake the Highland clans of old. He's looking for a giant, I think. Someone with the strength of 10 men and the heart of a villain." Mrs. Kennedy leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A giant? He's a fool, that Blair. You don't need the strength of 10 men if you know how to use a lever, Hamish. Even I know that. But that woman, Mrs. Gore-Smythe, she was here only this morning, you know. Standing right where you are now, demanding to see the redirected mail logs. She was looking for someone, Hamish. Someone she called the ghost of Lochdubh. She said there was a secret in this village that was worth more than the hotel itself." Hamish tilted his head, his interest piqued despite his sleepy expression. "A ghost, you say? And did she find what she was looking for in your logs, Mrs. Kennedy?" "She found something that made her smile," the postmistress said grimly. "And it wasn't a kind smile. It was the sort of smile a cat gives a mouse just before the crunch. She left here in a hurry, heading toward the manse. I think she wanted to have a word with the minister about certain records from 20 years ago." "I see," Hamish murmured. "And would there be any chance of a cup of tea, Mrs. Kennedy? The rain has found its way to my very bones, and Lugs here is about to turn into a puddle of misery." "Och, you're a moocher, Macbeth. A total moocher. But come through. I have some ginger cake that's just on the edge of being too dry." Hamish followed her into the back room, successfully securing a free snack and a vital clue. As he sipped the scalding tea, he realized the mooching phase of the investigation was going better than Blair's forensic circus. Fenella hadn't just been annoying, she had been blackmailing. Or at least, she had been digging up the kind of dirt that stayed wet for decades. After finishing the cake, Hamish made his way to the Lochdubh Hotel. He needed to see Rupert Gore-Smythe, but more importantly, he needed to see how the village was reacting to the vacuum left by the victim's demise. The bar was busier than usual. In the Highlands, a tragedy was often treated as a legitimate reason for an extra dram. Rory Curry was behind the taps, his face a mask of professionally curated gloom. He slid a bowl of venison stew across the bar toward Hamish without being asked. "On the house, Hamish. But don't go telling the inspectors. They'd want a bowl too, and I'm not feeding that lot from Strathbane for free." Hamish began to eat, his eyes scanning the room. In the far corner, tucked away in the shadows, sat Rupert Gore-Smythe. He didn't look like a grieving widower. She looked like a man who had spent his entire life waiting for a loud noise to stop, and now that it finally had, he didn't know what to do with the silence. He was staring at a glass of neat whiskey, as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Hamish wandered over, his bowl of stew in hand, looking every bit the bumbling village copper. Terrible business, Mr. Gorsmythe. Truly terrible. I can't tell you how sorry we all are. Lochdubh isn't usually like this, you know. Most days, the biggest crime is a misplaced sheep. Rupert looked up, his eyes bloodshot. She wouldn't stop, Constable, I told her. I told her these people have long memories, but Fenella always thought she was the smartest person in the room. She thought the rules of London applied here. She thought if you poked a hornet's nest with a gold-plated stick, the hornets would be too impressed to sting. She was writing about a secret, was she not? Hamish asked softly, his voice barely audible over the clink of glasses at the bar. Something about a ghost. Rupert let out a short, dry laugh. The ghost was not a person, Macbeth. It was a scandal. A child that shouldn't have been, a fire that wasn't an accident, and a name that was wiped from the parish records. She found the link. She was going to name names in her final chapter. She called it her masterpiece of malice. Hamish nodded, his mind spinning. The motive wasn't money. It was the preservation of a reputation. In a small village, a reputation was more valuable than gold. He looked at the manuscript pages he had seen stuffed in her mouth. They weren't just a mockery, they were a retrieval. The killer had wanted to stop the story from being told. As he finished his stew, Hamish felt the weight of the investigation shifting. MacRae would spend the night chasing strongmen and fishermen, but Hamish knew the answer lay in the old records and the quiet corners of the manse. He stood up, thanking Rory for the food. "Where are you off to now, Hamish?" Rory asked, wiping the bar with a damp cloth. "Going to arrest the wind." "No, Rory," Hamish said, his lilt returning to its most innocent tone. "I think I'll just go see the minister. I have a sudden urge to learn about local history. It's a fascinating subject, don't you think?" He stepped back out into the rain, Lugs at his heels. The investigation was no longer about a dead outsider. It was about the heart of Lochdubh itself. And Hamish Macbeth, the laziest policeman in the Highlands, was the only one who knew how to listen to the silence. The cold air hit Hamish like a physical blow as he stepped from the smoky, warm cocoon of the hotel bar into the darkness of the Highland night. Lugs gave a mournful whimper, his small body shivering as the dankness seeped back into his fur. The street lamps of Lochdubh were few and far between, casting long, wavering shadows across the glistening tarmac. Just as Hamish was about to turn toward the manse, a pair of headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the swirling mist like two celestial searchlights. A sleek, silver Volvo pulled up to the curb with a whisper of expensive tires. The driver's side window slid down with a smooth, electric hum, and the elegant profile of Priscilla Halberton-Smythe was revealed against the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She looked as though she had just stepped out of a fashion magazine, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the miserable Sutherland weather. "Hamish, is that you? You look absolutely wretched," she said, her voice a cool, refined melody that always made Hamish feel as though he should be wearing a tie and standing up straighter. "It is me, Priscilla," Hamish replied, leaning down so his face was level with the window. "And wretched is a fair description of the evening's events. I assume you have heard the news. The village is buzzing like a nest of angry wasps." Priscilla sighed, her gloved hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "It's hard not to hear when DCI Blair is shouting loud enough to be heard in Inverness. My father is in a towering rage. He says the police presence is ruining the stalking season. But I didn't stop to talk about my father's temper. I wanted to see if you were all right. You have that look about you, Hamish. The look you get when you're about to do something brave and terribly inconvenient for your career." Hamish gave her a lopsided smile, his heart doing a small, treacherous somersault. Priscilla was the daughter of the local squire, a woman of grace and education who moved in circles Hamish only observed from the outside. Their relationship was a complicated tapestry of unsaid things and missed opportunities, a delicate dance between a lowly village constable and a lady of the manor. He often dreamed of a life with her, but the reality of his small police house and his love for poaching salmon always seemed to stand in the way of her world of hunt balls and social climbing. "I'm just doing my job, Priscilla, or trying to, while Blair isn't looking," he said. "What did you make of her, Mrs. Gorsmythe? I know she spent some time up at the big house yesterday." Priscilla's expression darkened slightly. "She was a poisonous woman, Hamish. There's no point in being polite about the dead when they were as ghastly as Fenella. She came to tea, ostensibly to discuss the local history for her book, but she spent the entire time trying to trip my father up on old land boundaries and family debts. She wasn't just a gossip, she was a collector of shames. She had this way of looking at you, as if she already knew your most embarrassing secret and was simply deciding whether or not to publish it. She had no respect for the delicate balance we maintain here. Rupert mentioned something about a ghost of Lochdubh, Hamish said, watching her closely. A scandal involving a fire and a missing name. Does that mean anything to you? Priscilla looked out through the windscreen, her gaze fixed on the dark silhouette of the mountains. It means something to everyone who was here 20 years ago, Hamish. But it's the sort of thing people have agreed to forget. There was a fire at the old croft near the glen. A young woman died. She was a stranger, at least. That was the official story. But she wasn't a stranger to everyone. There were rumors that a prominent local man had been visiting her. When the fire happened, the records of her stay were misplaced. The investigation was handled very quietly, very quickly. Fenella had found the old police logs, the ones Blair's predecessors didn't shred. She was digging in a graveyard, and she was going to name the man. She hinted at it, Priscilla said, turning back to him. She told my father that the pillars of the community are often built on ash. She was incredibly smug about it. But Hamish, you're looking at this as a crime of passion or greed. You need to understand the social dynamics here. In a place like Lochdubh, being a pillar of the community isn't just about pride. It's about power. If that scandal came out, it wouldn't just ruin a reputation, it would dismantle a legacy. The person who killed her didn't do it just to stay out of jail. They did it to stay in the pulpit, or the manor, or the council seat. They killed her to keep the status quo from shattering. Hamish nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into a grim new shape. She was shaking the foundations of the village, and the village shook back. Exactly, Priscilla murmured. She was a Sassenach who thought our silence was a sign of stupidity. She didn't realize that in the Highlands, silence is a weapon of survival. Do be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for a brute with a caber. But I suspect the person you're looking for is someone who knows exactly how to pour a cup of tea without spilling a single drop. I'll be careful, Hamish promised. Will you be at the hotel later? I might be. If only to see Blair trip over his own ego. Good night, Hamish. The window slid back up, and the Volvo glided away into the mist, leaving Hamish alone with the cold and the smell of her perfume, which lingered in the damp air like a ghost of its own. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. He was the protector of this village, but he was also its outsider, the man who knew too much but could say too little. He adjusted his cap, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't go to the manse just yet. First, he needed to visit the old croft near the glen. If the ghost of Lochdubh was born in fire, perhaps there were still some embers left in the scorched earth. He whistled for Lugs and began the long trek toward the glen. The rain started again, a soft, insistent drumming on his shoulders, but Hamish didn't notice. He was thinking about pillars of the community and the weight of secrets that could crush a woman as easily as a log of pine. He knew that by morning, Blair would have arrested Archie McLean or some other innocent soul. Time was running out, and the Highlands were never in a hurry to reveal their dead. He had to find the truth before the silence of Lochdubh became permanent, and another secret was buried in the peat. The walk to the old croft was a journey through a landscape that seemed to be dissolving into a liquid state of existence. The heather was a sodden mass of brown and purple, and the air was so thick with moisture that Hamish felt as though he were breathing through a wet sponge. Lugs followed with a dogged persistence, his small legs working hard to navigate the peat-filled ruts. The croft itself sat on a lonely ridge, a jagged outline of blackened stone that stood as a grim monument to a fire that had burned with a heat far greater than the Highland rain could ever douse. As Hamish reached the ruins, he paused, the silence here different from the silence of the village. This was a hollow, hungry silence, the kind that whispered of old sins and the weight of things left unsaid. He moved through the remnants of what had once been a doorway, his flashlight cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The floor was a carpet of rotted timber and ash, but amidst the decay, his eye caught a glint of something that did not belong to the earth. He knelt, ignoring the dampness that seeped into his trousers, and picked up a small object. It was a silver cufflink, engraved with a delicate intertwining pattern of ivy. It was expensive, the kind of thing one might wear to a formal dinner or a high-level meeting of the local council. It was also remarkably clean, as if it had only recently been dropped. This was not a relic from 20 years ago. This was a contemporary intrusion. As he stood up, his radio crackled to life, the sound an abrasive intrusion into the haunted stillness of the glen. "Macbeth, do you hear me, you ginger-haired derelict?" Blair's voice was triumphant, vibrating with a self-important glee that made Hamish wince. "Get yourself back to the station immediately. I've caught him. I've caught the Highland brute red-handed. We've got the killer in the cells, and I want you here to witness a real interrogation." Hamish sighed, slipping the cufflink into his pocket. Is that so, sir? And who might this killer be? Archie McLean, of course. Who else? He's got the strength. He's got the motive. Apparently the victim called him a backward peasant, and we found a yellow thread from her oilskin snagged on his fishing sweater. It's an open and shut case. I'll have a confession before the pubs close. Now move. The radio went dead. Hamish looked at Lugs, who let out a soft, skeptical woof. Aye, Lugs, an open and shut case, which usually means Blair has found the most convenient lid to close. By the time Hamish reached the small police station in Lochdubh, the building was glowing like a lighthouse against the dark pier. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cheap cigarettes and Blair's overwhelming aura of arrogance. Archie McLean was sitting in a hard wooden chair, his face a mask of bewildered terror. He looked smaller than usual, his massive shoulders hunched as if trying to hide his very existence from the shouting DCI. There he is, Blair shouted as Hamish entered. The man who thinks he's too smart for Strathbane. Look at him, Macbeth. Look at your friend. He is a murderer. He crushed that woman like a beetle under a boot. Evening, Archie, Hamish said mildly, leaning against the doorframe. You look a bit stressed, so you do. Hamish, tell them, Archie pleaded, his voice cracking. I didn't do it. I was at the pier. Aye. But I was fixing the nets. I never touched that woman. The yellow thread, I don't know how it got there. I might have brushed past her when she was shouting at me this morning. Quiet, Blair slammed his hand on the desk. We have the physical evidence, McLean. We have the strength required to drop a caber, and we have your clear animosity toward the deceased. Hamish stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Archie's feet. Sir, if I might ask a small question. It's a very simple one, as befits a simple man like myself. Blair rolled his eyes. Make it quick, Macbeth. I have a report to write and a promotion to celebrate. Archie, Hamish said, his voice soft. Where are your boots? The ones you are wearing today? Archie pointed to a pair of heavy, salt-stained Wellington boots sitting in the corner of the room. The inspector made me take them off, said they were evidence. Hamish walked over to the boots and picked them up. He examined the soles with the intense concentration of a man looking at a rare manuscript. Tell me, sir, Hamish said, turning to Blair. Did your forensic team find any mud at the scene? Specifically, the thick grey-black peat mud that surrounds the Rowan Grove where the body was found. Of course they did, Blair snapped. The whole place is a swamp. Then why? Hamish asked, his voice dropping into a deceptively innocent lilt. Is there no grey-black peat on Archie's boots? These are covered in white sand and sea salt, the kind of sand you only find at the old pier where Archie says he was working. Not a speck of peat, and if he had carried a caber through that grove, he would have been ankle-deep in the stuff. Blair's face twitched. He could have changed his boots. Traer let out a frustrated growl and turned on his heel, gesturing for his subordinates to follow. I am going to the castle anyway. I want a statement from the colonel. And you, Macbeth, stay out of my way. If I find out you are withholding more information, I will have you directing traffic in the middle of a Strathbane roundabout by Monday. As the doors slammed shut behind the DCI, Hamish turned back to Penelope. She was smiling now, a cold, thin expression that did not reach her eyes. Well, Constable, she murmured. It seems your boss is a bit of a fool, but you? You are much more interesting than you look. Hamish didn't smile back. He was thinking about the blue feather in his pocket and the spotless shoes Penelope was wearing. She claimed she hadn't left the hotel, yet she knew exactly how much the village disliked Croft. The trap was beginning to take shape, but he needed one more piece of the puzzle, the motive that went beyond a simple business betrayal. He bowed slightly to her and walked out, his mind already moving toward the next move in this deadly Highland dance. Hamish stepped out of the hotel and inhaled the salt-stung air of the harbour. The mist had finally pulled back to the peaks, leaving the village of Lochdubh looking like a postcard that had been left out in the rain. He watched Blair's car disappear up the hill toward the castle, the blue lights still flashing with self-important urgency. Blair was hunting for a motive in a silver case and a land dispute, but Hamish knew that while money and land could make a man angry, only something far more intimate could make a person stand in the freezing rain on a desolate ridge, to push a man into a pit of arsenic. He walked along the stone pier, his boots clicking rhythmically. Child, sniffing at a discarded fish head with more enthusiasm than he had shown all morning. Hamish's mind returned to Penelope Vane. She was sharp, bitter, and certainly had the means. But would a woman like that, so obsessed with her own comfort, risk the mud and the filth of a sheep dip for a business grudge? No, Penelope was the type to hire a lawyer to ruin a man's life, not a person to ruin her own manicure by committing murder. He paused by the small, whitewashed cottage of Mrs. Gentle. She was a woman who lived up to her name only in the sense that she moved quietly. In reality, she was the village's most prolific weaver, and her loom sat by a window that overlooked the road to the messy entire croft. Hamish had often found that those who sat in silence, working with their hands, saw the things that the shouting men missed. "Morning, Mrs. Gentle," Hamish called out as he leaned over her low garden wall. "That's a fine bit of tweed you're working on there." The old woman looked up, her fingers never stopping their intricate dance. "It's for the minister's wife, Hamish, a heavy weight for the winter. You're looking for the truth about the Englishman, I suppose. The whole village is talking about nothing else. I am. You see a lot from that window, I'm thinking. Did Mr. Croft have many visitors that didn't arrive in a cloud of dust and a fancy car?" Mrs. Gentle slowed her work. "He was a man who thought he was very clever, Hamish. He used to walk down this road in the evenings, thinking no one was watching. But I saw him. He wasn't always alone. There was a girl. A local girl." Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. "A girl? From the village? She'd meet him at the edge of the woods. He'd bring her flowers, the kind you buy in a shop, not the ones that grow in the glen. He was promising her the world, I think, telling her he'd take her away from this damp little puddle, as he called it. And who was she? Mrs. Gentle. It was young Mary, the girl who helps out at the hotel. A sweet thing, but far too impressionable for a man with teeth that white and a heart that black." Hamish thanked her and moved on, his pace quickening. Mary was the niece of Rory, the barman. She was a quiet, shy girl who had always seemed a bit overwhelmed by the bustle of the hotel guests. If Croft had been dallying with her, he wasn't just building a resort, he was playing with the one thing a Highlander valued more than land: family honour. He found Mary in the hotel's laundry room, surrounded by steam and the smell of hot linens. She looked up as he entered, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Oh, Constable," she whispered, twisting a white pillowcase in her hands. "It's a terrible thing that has happened." "It is indeed, Mary," Hamish said, his voice gentle. "I heard you and Mr. Croft were friends. He was a man who promised a lot, wasn't he?" Mary broke down then, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Croft hadn't been in love with her, he had been using her to find out who owned the various parcels of land surrounding the entire croft. He had promised to marry her, to take her to London, but only if she could get her uncle Rory to sell a small strip of land that controlled the water rights to the hill. When Rory had refused, Croft had turned cruel, mocking her, and threatening to tell the whole village she had been throwing herself at him. "He was going to shame me, Hamish," she sobbed. "He laughed at me. She said I was just a local convenience, until he got what he wanted." Hamish felt a surge of cold anger. It wasn't about an eco-resort or a land dispute. It was about a man who viewed people as objects to be used and discarded. Croft hadn't been murdered because he was a businessman, he had been murdered because he was a bully who had pushed a quiet, proud family too far. He left the laundry room and found Rory at the bar, cleaning glasses with a mechanical, joyless intensity. The man didn't look up when Hamish approached. "You knew, didn't you, Rory?" Hamish asked softly. "You knew what he was doing to Mary." Rory stopped cleaning. He looked at Hamish, his eyes hard and flat. "He was a parasite, Hamish. He came here with his money and his lies, thinking he could buy whatever he wanted. He thought we were all just backdrop for his fancy life. He didn't care who he hurt. And you saw him yesterday, up on the ridge." Rory didn't answer immediately. He set the glass down with a slow, deliberate click. "I saw him. I went up there to tell him to stay away from her. He was standing by that sheep dip, laughing. He told me I was a peasant, and that Mary was lucky he had even looked at her. He said he'd have the land one way or another." Hamish realized then that the motive was the most basic one of all. Protection. It wasn't greed. It was the desperate act of a man trying to save his family from a predator. But as he looked at Rory, he noticed something. Rory was a sturdy man, but he was getting on in years, and he had a bad hip from a fall in the winter. Could he have wrestled a man like Croft into a tank, or was there someone else? Someone who had been helpful all along, guiding the investigation away from the truth. G's mind flashed back to the Sassenach tension and the way the crime had been discovered. Archie McLean. Archie, who was Rory's cousin and had been protective of Mary since she was a child. Archie, who knew every inch of that ridge and every stone of that sheep dip. Hamish leaned against the bar, his heart heavy. The honest man title of the case felt like a bitter joke now. Croft had been anything but honest, and the men who had killed him were perhaps the most honest men in the villages who protected their own. But the law didn't care about honor or protection, it cared about dead bodies in sheep dips. "I'll be needing to speak with Archie again, Rory," Hamish said, his voice barely a whisper. "I think he saw more than he told me." Rory looked at him, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Do what you have to do, Hamish. But remember, some people deserve to be in a hole." Hamish walked out into the cooling afternoon, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had found the motive, and it was as human and petty as a broken heart and a bruised ego. Now, he just had to decide how the story would end, and how he would keep DCI Blair from destroying the lives of two men who had simply had enough of being treated like dirt. He whistled for Lugs, but for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He just felt like a man who wanted to go home and close the door. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long, dark shadows over Lochdubh. The peace of the village was a fragile thing, held together by silence and shared secrets. Hamish knew that by tomorrow, that peace would be tested. He had the pieces now: the feather, the letter, the girl, and the pride of a Highland family. The trial that remained was to set the trap, and to do it in a way that would not leave the village he loved in ruins. He climbed into his Land Rover, the engine's groan echoing his own weariness. The hidden motive had been revealed, and it was far darker than any land dispute could ever be. It was the darkness of a man who thought he was better than the people around him, and the darkness of those who had proven him wrong in the most final way possible. He drove toward Archie's cottage, the wheels churning the mud of the coastal road. The investigation was almost over, but the hardest part was yet to come. He had to be a policeman, but he also had to be a neighbor. And in Lochdubh, those two things were often at war. As he reached the gate, he saw Archie sitting on his porch, staring out at the water. The man didn't move as Hamish pulled up. He just waited. And Hamish, the man who knew how to listen to what people didn't say, knew exactly what Archie was thinking. The truth was out, and the Highlands would never be quite the same again. Croft had wanted to change Lochdubh, and in a way, he had. He had turned honest men into murderers, and he had left a quiet constable with a choice that would haunt him long after the mist had cleared. Hamish stayed at the gate of Archie McLean's cottage for a long, silent minute, the damp cold of the evening beginning to seep through his regulation trousers. Archie hadn't moved. He remained a motionless silhouette against the darkening wood of the porch, staring out at the grey, unblinking eye of the loch. The silence between them was thick, laden with the unsaid things that always governed life in Lochdubh. Hamish knew that if he pushed now, if he acted like a real policeman from the city, Archie would clam up tighter than a frozen cockle. He had to be the Hamish they expected, the one who was a bit slow on the uptake, and more concerned with his next meal than a grand arrest. "It's a fine evening for staring, Archie," Hamish said, his voice a gentle, melodic lilt. "Though I imagine the view is a bit cluttered with all those blue lights up at the castle. DCI's Blair is in a rare state. He's found the Colonel's cigarette case, and he's convinced the old man did it. It's a pity. The Colonel's heart isn't what it was. A night in the cells at Strathbane might just be the end of him." He saw Archie's shoulders stiffen, just a fraction. "But then," Hamish continued, "Blair is a man who misses the trees for the forest. He hasn't even looked at the secondary evidence. The London lady, Miss Vane, has been talking. She's a sharp one, that. She told me she saw someone on the ridge. Not the Colonel, someone shorter. Someone who dropped a very distinctive brass button from a ghillie's jacket. I've got it in my pocket right now." Hamish patted his pocket, though it contained nothing but a spare lead for Lugs and a crumpled receipt. Archie's eyes flickered toward Hamish's jacket, a flash of something like a trapped animal's panic behind his weathered eyelids. "A button, you say?" Archie asked, his voice rasping like sandpaper on stone. "Aye, a brass one with a stag's head. Very common, I suppose, but this one has a peculiar scratch across the eye. Miss Vane says she knows the man who wore it anywhere. I have told her to stay at the hotel until tomorrow morning, when the specialist arrives from the city with the forensic magnification kit. It's a new thing, Archie. Can see DNA on a thread from 50 paces, or so they tell me." Hamish didn't wait for a reply. He gave a small, lazy wave and climbed back into the Land Rover, leaving the seed of doubt to germinate in the fertile soil of Archie's guilt. He drove straight to the Tommel Castle Hotel, but he didn't go to the kitchen this time. He went into the public bar. It was crowded, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and the nervous energy of a village under siege. Rory was behind the taps, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Hamish made a point of looking tired and flustered. He leaned against the bar and let out a theatrical sigh. A double whiskey, Rory. And make it a large one. I'm about at the end of my tether with this lot from Strathbane. The bar went quiet. Every ear in the room was tuned to the frequency of the law. Blair is making a mess of it, Hamish announced loudly to the room. He's got the Colonel in his sights, but I've got the real evidence sitting in a jar on my desk at the station. That brass button is going to hang someone, and I'm just hoping it's not a friend. I've got to head back there now to meet the transport from Glasgow. They're coming for the evidence at 10 o'clock tonight. I'm just popping in here to grab a bite before the long night starts. I've left the station unlocked, no one ever bothers it, but I suppose I should get back before someone decides to play a prank. He caught Rory's eye. The bartender's face was a mask of pale exhaustion. Hamish took his whiskey, downed it in one, and turned to the room. If any of you see Archie, tell him to stay away from the ridge. The police dogs will be out later, and they're not as friendly as Lugs here. He whistled for the dog and marched out, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The trap was set. He had lied about the button, lied about the specialist, and lied about the DNA. Most importantly, he had provided a window of opportunity. Between now and 10 o'clock, the station was unprotected, and the evidence that could hang a friend was sitting right there for the taking. He didn't drive to the station. Instead, he drove the Land Rover half a mile past it, tucked it into a hidden track behind a stand of Scots pines, and walked back through the heather. The rain had started again, a fine, stinging mist that turned the world into a monochromatic blur. He reached the police station from the rear, slipping through the back door deliberately left ajar. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness of the small side office, the smell of old paper and cold peat smoke surrounding him. Lugs sat at his feet, sensing the tension and remaining perfectly still. Hamish checked his watch. It was 9:15. He had created a ghost brass button that didn't exist to haunt the man who had actually stood over the sheep dip. He knew how the mind of a good man worked when he had done a bad thing. He wouldn't want the Colonel to suffer, but more than that, he wouldn't be able to live with the idea of a scientific proof of his presence. In the Highlands, you could argue with a man, but you couldn't argue with a machine from Glasgow. The minutes crawled by, measured by the rhythmic dripping of a leak in the gutter. Then, the sound of a footfall. It wasn't the heavy, confident stride of a city man, it was the light, careful tread of someone used to walking on uneven ground. The front door of the station creaked open. The floorboards in the main office groaned. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the desk, searching for the jar that Hamish had described. Hamish stood up, his tall shadow stretching across the wall. He didn't pull his truncheon. He didn't shout. He simply stepped into the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the street lamp outside. It's a long walk from the hotel in the rain, isn't it? Hamish said softly. The flashlight beam whirled around, catching Hamish in its blinding glare. But Hamish didn't blink. He knew the man behind the light, and he knew the weight of the secret that had brought him here. The trap had snapped shut, and the piece of Lochdubh was about to be broken one last time. The flashlight beam didn't just waver, it dropped, the circle of white light skittering across the scarred wooden floorboards to rest on Hamish's scuffed boots. In the sudden, harsh glare, Archie McLean looked like a man who had already been buried and dug back up. His face was a map of exhaustion, his skin the color of old parchment, and his eyes, usually so keen for the movement of a deer or the flight of a bird, were hollowed out by a despair that went deeper than any fear of the law. He stood there, his hand trembling so violently that the flashlight clattered against the side of the desk, its beam dancing erratically across the posters of missing persons and sheep-dipping regulations that adorned the walls of the small station. "There is no button, Archie," Hamish said, his voice a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate in the cramped office. He didn't move from the doorway, his tall frame a solid barrier against the night. "I never found a brass button with a stag's head. I never found a scratch across an eye. It was just a story I told to see who would come looking for it. A man with a clean conscience wouldn't care about a bit of metal in a jar, but a man carrying the weight of a dead Sassenach, well, that's a different matter entirely, isn't it?" He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a sob caught in his throat. He slumped against the desk, the flashlight finally slipping from his fingers to roll across the floor, its light now pointing uselessly at a spider, making its way toward the radiator. "You always were too clever for your own good, Macbeth," Archie whispered, his voice cracking. "The village thinks you're a fool, a lazy boy who'd rather poach a salmon than serve a warrant. But I knew you saw things the others missed. You see the heart of people, And that's a dangerous thing in a place like Lochdubh, where hearts are so often hidden. Hamish sighed, a sound of genuine regret. He reached out and clicked on the desk lamp, the sudden yellow glow making them both squint. The station felt smaller now, crowded with the reality of what was happening. I saw the blue feather, Archie. It didn't come from a hat. Penelope Vane would not be caught dead in a sheep dip, and she certainly would not be standing on a ridge in the middle of a Highland gale. That feather was a law, planted just like the cigarette case. You and Rory thought you were being clever, didn't you? Using the Sassenach lady and the colonel as shields. You knew Blair would jump at the chance to arrest someone with a title or a London address. You figured if the police were busy chasing the gentry, they'd never look at a couple of local men protecting a girl's honor. Archie's head snapped up, a flash of the old fire in his eyes. He was a beast, Hamish. He was going to ruin Mary. He was going to shame her and steal the land that has been in our family since the clearings. He laughed at us. He stood by that tank and told us we were nothing but set dressing for his new world. Rory didn't mean to do it. He just wanted to talk. But Croft, he swung at him. He called Rory a peasant. I couldn't stand by and watch. I didn't mean for him to drown. Not really. I just wanted him to stop talking. I wanted him to feel the cold of the water he was so keen to build his glass palace over. And now he's dead, Hamish said flatly. And Rory's in the bar drinking himself into a stupor while you're here trying to steal a ghost. It won't work, Archie. The truth is, like a peat fire, you can smother it for a while, but it will eventually find a way to the surface. For a moment, the silence returned, heavier than the rain outside. Then something in Archie broke. It wasn't the sorrow of a repentant man, but the frantic, cornered panic of a wild animal. He lunged. Despite his age and his weathered frame, Archie moved with a desperate, wiry strength. He didn't go for Hamish, he dove for the window, thinking to shatter the glass and disappear into the darkness of the moor, where no city-born policeman could ever hope to find him. But Hamish Macbeth was not a city-born policeman. He was a man of the mountains, a man who had spent his life chasing stray sheep across Scree and tracking poachers through the deepest glens. With a speed that would have shocked DC Fars, Blair, Hamish moved. He didn't use a club or a heavy hand, he used the momentum of Archie's own flight. He caught the older man by the shoulder, his long fingers locking like iron bands, and pivoted. The two of them stumbled into the main office, crashing against the heavy wooden counter. Archie fought with the strength of the damned, kicking and scratching, his boots scuffing the floorboards in a frantic rhythm. Lugs began to bark, a sharp, piercing sound that filled the station. Hamish grunted as an elbow caught him in the ribs, but he didn't let go. He wrestled Archie toward the floor, using his weight to pin the man's arms. It was a messy, undignified struggle, the kind that never made it into the official police manuals. Hamish's hat was knocked askew, and a button popped off his own tunic, but he held on until Archie's strength finally spent itself. "Stop it, Archie," Hamish gasped, his face pressed against the rough wool of Archie's jacket. "It's over. There's nowhere to go. You can't run from the loch, and you can't run from yourself." Archie went limp, his body shaking with silent sobs. Hamish slowly let go, standing up and brushing the dust from his uniform. He looked down at the broken man on the floor, feeling a profound sense of weariness. This was the part of the job he hated, the part where the lines between right and wrong were blurred by the salt of human tears. He had caught the killer, but he felt no triumph, only a cold, hollow ache. "I'm sorry, Archie," Hamish whispered, adjusting his tunic. "I truly am. But the law has a long memory, even in Lochdubh." He reached for the telephone to make the call he had been dreading, his hand hovering over the receiver as the rain continued to beat its relentless, rhythmic tattoo against the window pane. The confrontation was finished, but the reckoning was only just beginning. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence of the station and the heavy breathing of the man at his feet. He knew that Blair would be here soon, shouting and preening, ready to take the credit for a case he had tried his best to ruin. Hamish looked at the empty jar on the desk, the one he had used as a decoy. Trite. It was a simple trick, a bit of village theatre, but it had worked because it relied on the one thing Croft had never understood, that in the Highlands, a man's conscience is his most relentless pursuer. He picked up the receiver and began to dial the number for the Strathbane headquarters, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. The trap had been a success, but as the dial turned, Hamish felt the weight of the promotion he so desperately wanted to avoid looming over him like the mountains themselves. He would have to think quickly if he wanted to remain the lazy constable of Lochdubh. Hamish stood by the telephone, the receiver still warm in his hand, looking down at Archie McLean with a mixture of pity and calculated desperation. The gravity of the situation was settling into the floorboards of the small Lochdubh police station, alongside the mud and the spent adrenaline of their scuffle. Hamish knew the clock was ticking. In a matter of minutes, he had to decide the trajectory of his entire future. If he acted like the brilliant detective he actually was, he would be lauded by the chief constable in Strathbane. There would be a formal commendation, a flurry of newspaper interest, and a mandatory promotion that would see him stripped of his mountains, his loch, and his quiet life, only to be deposited into the grey, concrete heart of a city precinct. To Hamish, that prospect was far more terrifying than any murderer. He looked at Archie, who was now sitting on the floor with his back against a filing cabinet, looking small and defeated. "Archie," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a low conspiratorial hum. "Listen to me, and listen well. DCI Blair will be here within 20 minutes. She is a man with the vanity of a peacock and the deductive skills of a ham sandwich. He wants a victory. He wants to be the one who broke the cleverest criminal in the Highlands. If I tell him I caught you with a trick and a bit of wrestling, he'll be annoyed that a peasant did his work for him. But if we play this right, if we make it seem like your conscience was shattered by his masterful presence earlier today, then he gets his glory, and I get to stay in Lochdubh." Archie wiped his eyes with a shaking hand, looking up at the tall constable. "What are you asking, Hamish?" "I have killed a man. There's no escaping that." "There is no escaping the law, Archie. No, you'll have to face the court. But the way the story is told matters. If you tell Blair that his brilliant interrogation at the hotel and his sharp eyes regarding the cigarette case made you realize the game was up, he will be so blinded by his own brilliance that he won't ask too many questions about why you're here now. I'll tell him you came to find me because you were terrified of his next move. You're a man who broke under the weight of professional police pressure. Do you understand? Not a man caught by a lazy policeman lie about a brass button." Archie nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing through his weary mind. He didn't care about Blair's ego, but he trusted Hamish. He knew Hamish belonged to the village, and if this lie helped Hamish stay, it was the least he could do after the mess he had made. Hamish then picked up the phone and dialed the Strathbane headquarters. When the operator connected him to Blair's office, the DCI's voice barked through the line like a dog with a sore throat. "Macbeth, this better be an apology for your insolence earlier," Blair roared. "Do you know, sir?" Hamish replied, his voice becoming a masterpiece of servile, wide-eyed admiration. "It's much more than that, sir. I'm calling to report that your strategy has worked perfectly. It was just as you predicted at the hotel. Your focus on the physical evidence and your commanding presence. It was too much for the local conscience. Archie McLean is here at the station, sir. He's completely broken. He says he couldn't handle another minute of knowing you were on the trail. He's ready to confess, but he's insisted that he will only speak to the man who truly outsmarted him. He's waiting for you, sir." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the sound of Blair's heavy breathing the only noise as the DC-5s processed this sudden elevation of his status. Then, his voice changed. It became grand, patronizing, and filled with a nauseating smugness. "I knew it, Macbeth. I told Anderson, didn't I? I told him that these hill people only respond to a firm hand and a superior intellect. I'm leaving now. I shall be there in record time. Keep him isolated. Do not, repeat, do not interfere with the suspect. I want the full credit for the confession recorded under my supervision. Do you understand, you ginger streak of nothing?" "Perfectly, sir," Hamish said, suppressing a grin. "I'm just the witness to your triumph." 20 minutes later, the quiet street of Lochdubh was once again invaded by the screaming sirens and flashing lights of the Strathbane police. 2 patrol cars and Blair's black sedan screeched to a halt outside the station. Blair practically tumbled out of the car, his face flushed with the heat of impending glory. She marched into the station, followed by a weary Anderson and MacNab, who looked like they had spent the last hour being lectured on Blair's greatness. Hamish stood at attention, his cap held over his heart, looking for all the world like a simpleton who had just witnessed a miracle. "He's in the back room, sir. Very quiet. He's been asking for you every 5 minutes." Blair didn't even look at Hamish. He brushed past him, his chest puffed out so far that his waistcoat buttons were under visible strain. He entered the side office where Archie sat waiting. Hamish watched through the open door as Blair hovered over the seated crofter. "So, McLean," Blair boomed, his voice echoing off the walls. "You finally realized that you couldn't hide from a detective chief inspector, eh? You thought you could hide behind the mist and the rocks, but my investigation into the land deeds and that silver case was too much for you, wasn't it?" Archie looked at Hamish, saw the slight nod, and then turned back to Blair. "Aye, sir," Archie said, his voice flat. "It was the way you looked at that cigarette case. I knew then that a man of your experience would find the rest. I couldn't live with the fear of what you would do next." Blair turned to Anderson, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. "Did you hear that? Write it down." Suspect admitted to being overwhelmed by the DCI's deductive process. "This is textbook, Anderson, absolute textbook." For the next hour, Hamish stood in the shadows of the main office, watching as Blair dominated the scene. The DCI dictated the confession, adding flourishes of his own investigative brilliance to Archie's simple admission of the struggle at the sheep dip. She completely ignored the blue feather, the brass button lie, and the fact that Hamish had been the one to actually secure the man. To Blair, Hamish was merely the furniture, a convenient witness to his own ascension. When the time came to take Archie away, Blair paused at the door. He looked back at Hamish, who was currently leaning against the counter, looking as lazy and unmotivated as ever. "Well, Macbeth," Blair sneered, "I suppose even a useless peasant like you can be of some service if he knows how to follow orders. I'll mention in my report that you managed to keep the station open while I solved the crime, but don't expect a promotion. You don't have the temperament for real police work. You're lucky to be here at all." "I know that, sir," Hamish said, his voice a picture of humility. "I'm just happy to have seen a master at work." As the cars sped away into the night, taking the killer and the credit with them, Hamish let out a long, slow sigh of relief. The danger had passed. He wasn't going to be a hero. He wasn't going to be promoted. He was just Hamish Macbeth, the lazy constable of a quiet village, and he was staying exactly where he belonged. He reached down and ruffled Lugs' ears, the dog looking up with a knowing wag of his tail. "Well, boy," Hamish whispered, "the Sassenach is gone, the colonel is safe, and we still have our stove. I'd say that's a fair day's work for a man of my limited abilities." He walked to the window, watching the tail lights disappear into the Highland dark, perfectly content to be the smartest man in a room that everyone thought was empty. Thursday dawned with a sky the color of a pale bluebell, the kind of morning that made the previous 48 hours feel like a fever dream born of damp wool and cheap whiskey. Hamish Macbeth stood on the step of the police station, a broom in hand, and a lingering ache in his side where Archie's elbow had made its mark. The village of Lochdubh was stirring, but it was a different sort of movement than the day before. The frantic energy brought by Crispin Croft and the arrival of the Strathbane police had evaporated, leaving behind the heavy, comfortable silence of a place that had successfully purged a foreign object from its system. Hamish watched the post van rattle past, the driver giving a short, solemn nod. The news of Archie's arrest had travelled through the village faster than a Highland gale, but there was no sense of outrage. Instead, there was a quiet, somber acceptance. In Lochdubh, people understood the price of protection. They knew that sometimes, to keep the peace, a man had to lose his own. He spent the morning performing domestic chores that DC5's Blair would have found beneath the dignity of a detective, but which Hamish found strangely therapeutic. He scrubbed the floor where the struggle had taken place, erased the muddy bootprints of the Strathbane officers, and carefully filed away the paperwork that would officially close the file on the death of an honest man. The title of the case file sat on his desk, a stark reminder of the irony defining the entire investigation. Crispin Croft had been anything but honest, yet in the eyes of the law, he was the victim, and the men who had sought to protect a young girl's future were the villains. A light tap at the door interrupted his ruminations. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive perfume, something floral but with a sharp, intelligent edge, preceded her. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe stepped into the station, looking radiant in a tweed suit that matched the morning sky. "I saw the headlines in the Strathbane Gazette, Hamish," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Blair breaks Highland murderer. It's quite a glowing tribute to his investigative genius. I particularly liked the part where he describes tracking the suspect through the treacherous terrain of the local psyche." Hamish leaned his broom against the wall and offered her the only chair that didn't have a pile of old National Geographics on it. "Aye." He was very proud of that phrase, Priscilla. He spent 20 minutes refining it before he left. "I believe he thinks it makes him sound like a poet." "And you, of course, were mentioned as assisting with the administrative duties," she noted, her blue eyes narrowing. "Why do you do it, Hamish? Why let a man like that walk away with your work? You could have been the hero of the hour. My father is already telling everyone that you're the only one with any sense in the whole department, even if you did let Blair stomp around the castle like a rogue elephant." Hamish shrugged, a slow, lazy movement. If I were a hero, Priscilla, I would be a hero in a city office. I would be wearing a suit and attending meetings about budget allocations and urban crime statistics. Here, I'm just the man who looks after the sheep and keeps an eye on the poachers. I like my life here. I like the way the lock looks in the evening, and I like knowing that I can go for a walk without checking my watch. Fame is a very noisy thing, and I prefer the quiet. Priscilla sighed, a sound of frustrated affection. You are an impossible man, Hamish Macbeth, but I suppose that's why you're still here. My father wanted me to thank you, by the way. He realized this morning that he had misplaced his cigarette case days ago. He had left it at the hotel after a lunch meeting with Croft. He was quite relieved that Blair didn't try to pin the whole thing on him, though he's still grumbling about the police harassment. Tell the Colonel he is welcome, Hamish said. And tell him to keep a better eye on his belongings. Red herrings are all well and good in stories, but they are a messy business in real life. They talked for a while longer, the easy, familiar conversation of two people who understood each other's silences. When Priscilla finally left, the station felt a little colder, a little emptier. Hamish watched her drive away, then whistled for Lugs. It was time for his afternoon patrol, which usually involved a slow walk to the hotel and a check on the state of the harbour. The Tommel Castle Hotel was quiet. The Sassenach guests had mostly checked out, fleeing the sudden reality of Highland violence for the safer, more predictable comforts of the south. Rory was behind the bar, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but there was a new tiredness in the set of his shoulders. Mary was nowhere to be seen. Hamish had heard she had gone to stay with an aunt in Ullapool until the trial was over, and the gossip had died down. He didn't mention Archie. He didn't mention the sheep dip. He simply ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the gulls wheeling over the water. The village was returning to its routine, the dark undercurrent of the murder already being absorbed into the long, complicated history of the Glen. In a year's time, it would be just another story told over a dram of whiskey, the tale of the Englishman who thought he could buy the hills and ended up a part of them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the peaks, Hamish made his way back to his own small quarters. He built up the fire in his ancient stove, the smell of burning peat. The fire in the small peat stove crackled with a low, contented rhythm, casting long, dancing shadows across the whitewashed walls of Hamish Macbeth's kitchen. Outside, the Highland night had settled in with a vengeance, the wind whistling through the eaves of the police station, and the rain drumming a steady, familiar tattoo against the dark glass. It was a cold, lonely sound, but to Hamish, sitting in his favourite armchair with Lugs resting his chin on his boot, it was the sound of safety. It was the sound of a man who had successfully navigated the treacherous shoals of professional ambition and come out the other side exactly where he wanted to be. Nowhere in particular. On the small deal table beside him lay a copy of the Strathbane Sentinel. The front-page photograph featured DC Fast Blair, looking remarkably like a puffed-up bullfrog, standing on the steps of the courthouse. The headline blared in bold sensationalist type: Mastermind Blair cracks Highland murder. Crofter confesses to sheep dip killing. The article went on at great length about Blair's encyclopedic knowledge of land law and his unrelenting pressure on the local criminal element. Hamish's name appeared once, buried in the final paragraph, as the officer who had secured the station during the DCI's absence. Hamish reached out, picked up the paper, and without a trace of bitterness, tore the front page into thin strips. He fed them one by one into the stove, watching the ink of Blair's self-satisfied face curl and blacken before vanishing into the orange glow. To anyone else, the lack of credit would have been an insult, a professional slap in the face. To Hamish, it was a shield. Blair's ego had once again served as the perfect camouflage, ensuring that the authorities in Strathbane would continue to view their Lochdubh constable as a slow-witted, lazy Highland fixture, rather than a threat to their own promotions. He's happy, Lugs, Hamish murmured, the dog's tail thumping twice against the floorboards. He gets his medal and his headline, and we get to keep our stove and our peace. It's a fair trade, wouldn't you say? The case was officially closed, but the echoes of it lingered in the quiet corners of the village. Archie McLean was in a cell in Strathbane, awaiting trial. The village had already begun a collection for his legal defence, led by Mrs. Kennedy, and surprisingly, the Colonel. It was whispered in the Tommel Castle Hotel that Archie wouldn't serve a day more than was absolutely necessary. The local consensus was that Croft's death was less a murder and more a long overdue bit of Highland pest control. The honest man of the case title had been Croft, but as Hamish stared into the flames, he knew the only honesty in the whole sordid affair had belonged to Archie and Roramen, who had loved their own enough to do the unthinkable. A soft, muffled thump at the back door broke the silence. Hamish stood up, his joints protesting the movement, and walked into the small scullery. When he opened the door, there was no one there, only the wet, dark night and the smell of the sea. But on the mat sat a heavy, burlap sack. Hamish pulled it inside and opened it. Resting on a bed of damp ferns was a magnificent, silvery Atlantic salmon, its scales shimmering even in the dim light. There was no note, but none was needed. It was a gift from the poaching fraternity of Lochdubh, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had seen everything and chosen to tell the story that kept the village whole. "Well now," Hamish said, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "It seems we won't be having tin beans for dinner after all." He set about cleaning the fish with the practiced, efficient movements of a man who had done this many times before, usually under the cover of moonlight. As he worked, he thought about Priscilla. She had stopped by earlier that evening, ostensibly to drop off some magazines for the station, but her eyes had held a lingering question. She knew, of course. She knew exactly how Blair had come by his confession. She had offered him a look of profound, quiet admiration, a look that had made Hamish's heart do a strange, uncomfortable somersault. But the gap between the daughter of the castle and the constable of the village remained as wide as the loch, and Hamish was content to leave it so. A romantic complication was just another form of work, and he was currently off duty. By the time the salmon was simmering in a pan with a knob of butter and a splash of milk, the station felt like the center of the world. The aroma filled the kitchen, pushing back the damp chill of the Highlands. Hamish sat back down, a mug of strong, hot coffee in his hand, and watched the fire sink into a deep, ember-red glow. The Sassenach investment mogul was gone, his glass-fronted eco-resort a dead dream on a mist-shrouded ridge. The MC entire croft would remain a heap of stones, a monument to a past that refused to be paved over. The roads would remain rutted, the mist would continue to hide the secrets of the mountains, and the people of Lochdubh would continue to live their lives at a pace that no London clock could ever measure. Hamish felt a deep, soul-level satisfaction. He had protected his village, he had protected his friends, and most importantly, he had protected his own right to be exactly who he was. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a rising star, and he wasn't a lion of the north. He was just Hamish Macbeth, a man with a dog, a stove, and a very fresh salmon. As he began to eat, the telephone in the front office let out a single, half-hearted ring before falling silent, as if the caller had thought better of disturbing the peace of the night. Hamish didn't even turn his head. If it was important, they would call back in the morning. And if it wasn't, the silence was a much better companion. The rain continued to fall, the wind continued to howl, and in the small, warm heart of the Lochdubh police station, the smartest man in the Highlands closed his eyes and drifted into a well-earned, lazy sleep. The peace of the Highlands had been restored, and for Constable Hamish Macbeth, that was the only reward that ever truly mattered.